Good morning and welcome to Breakfast with Bev. I'm Bev Curtis with Bev & Co. at Hauser Brokers Realty Inc. And I have the pleasure this morning to be with Nathan Jones, who's a prominent attorney here in town with the Nathan Jones Law Practice. So Nathan, would you mind kind of sharing a little bit of information about yourself with us this morning?
Sure. My name's Nathan Jones, and I'm an estate and business attorney here in Columbia. I've been in practice for about 7 years and opened up my own firm about 2.5 years ago.
Fantastic. Well, and I know Alan and I have definitely been used Nathan's services all the time, and I have to say he's definitely a wealth of information, especially when it comes to that estate side and with real estate investments and all of that. So he's a wonderful resource. The reason why we have Nathan with us this morning is to kind of continue on with our part 2 series of our investments. And so last week we had the pleasure to visit with Jeff Radel with Hauser Brokers, and he has quite a rental portfolio. And we kind of talked about all the different types of investments, you know, everything from single family, duplexes, townhomes, raw land, all sorts of varying ways that you can invest in real estate. This next phase pretty much gears towards how do you protect that? And from the legal side of things, how do you set it up to protect yourself from the legal aspect, from the tax part of things, and just as far as your overall business kind of concept of structuring it all? Because the more you acquire, you certainly have to have some kind of system with it. And there's so many ins and outs in the legality side of it all. That's why I thought Nathan would be a wonderful person to visit with this morning to kind of share his perspective on that. So I guess my first question is, Nathan, is that if I'm either a new investor to the game, or let's say I've started my investments, but I'm kind of like, you know, finding my way through that process, where along the way should I be thinking about maybe like an LLC or some type of protection that I need to do? How would you see that looking?
Sure. So I represent a lot of businesses and particularly real estate investors here in town. And so it's a really common question. And the most common thing that people will use is an LLC. And so LLCs are great because they're pretty easy to set up. They grow really well with you. So whether you have one property or multiple properties, LLCs can be a good solution. And they provide a good layer of liability protection, which is what a lot of people are interested in.
You see that way more than like an S Corp, right? I mean,
sure. And so basically when you're setting up an entity, the most common types are going to be an LLC and a corporation. And so the nice thing is that an LLC is so flexible that it can actually elect to be an S Corp.
Okay.
So sometimes, as we get
Okay.
further into it, we'll work with an accountant and we'll decide that it's the right time to make an S Corp election to save on taxes.
Interesting. And you can help somebody set all of that up from the ground up.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep. Absolutely.
Very good. So what would you say are the important aspects of it then as far as setting up? Because I'm sure there's some do's and some don'ts.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. There are.
So kind of talk about that part of it, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So the easy part is just filing for an LLC with the state of Missouri. That's a pretty easy process. The problem is that sometimes people stop right there. And there are more things that you really need to do to get the liability protection from the LLC. And so in Missouri, all LLCs need to have a document called an operating agreement.
Okay.
And so that operating agreement, it lays out how the ownership is set up, who can make decisions for the LLC, that type of thing. So running an LLC without an operating agreement can actually make you lose your liability protection.
Wow.
And so that's one really important thing to do. If you have a partner or multiple owners in an LLC, it's also important for that operating agreement to lay out what happens if someone were to want out. Or you don't get along anymore, you want to buy each other out, or someone were to pass away or something like that. You want an agreement that's going to say what's happening to this property when that happens.
And does that have to be renewed at a certain point in time, or as far as like keep it on an annual basis? Or
it doesn't need to be renewed. It stays in effect pretty much until you change it or get rid of it, but it should definitely be revisited. Of course, things can change. You might acquire more property or sell some property, and so you might update it
Okay.
over time, but so it shouldn't be a static document that just sits there for 20 years.
Okay.
The other couple really important things to do when you've got an LLC would be your LLC should have its own separate tax ID number,
Okay.
which is called an EIN.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does is it actually allows, it kind of tells the IRS that this is a separate thing right here that I've created. And you go open up then a bank account for that LLC, and you should be really careful to run all of your business income and your business expenses through that bank account.
Okay.
One of the worst things that you can do is commingle your business and your personal funds.
Okay. Interesting. So that would definitely be a don't.
That's a don't.
Okay. Okay. Is there anything else that you would say would be pertinent information as far as that LLC?
Yeah, I think that it becomes really important to seek the advice and the annual services, at least, of a CPA.
Okay.
Once you create an LLC, a lot of
That
people
makes
do their
sense.
own taxes. There may be just W-2 employees, and they get on TurboTax or something like that, and that might be sufficient for them. But once you add in a business and an LLC, and there are a lot of deductions and new rules that you're probably not aware of, and that frankly TurboTax is not really designed to do.
Right.
Right. And so what I've found is that a good CPA pays for themselves many times over with the tax advice that they give.
Sure. So what if I'm just like a light investor, and let's just say I have one or two properties that I dabble in, and I'm like, I really don't want to go to all the expense and the time and the trouble of all the LLC stuff. What is my real liability exposure? Let's just say somebody's in that property, somebody gets hurt or something really bad happens. I mean, how much exposure or liability is that owner? What are you on the hook for on something like that?
Right. So that's what everyone's worried about, is someone getting hurt over the property, right? And so the first line of defense is always going to be having good insurance. So make sure, no matter how you have your property titled, whether it's in your name or in an LLC or a trust or anything else, make sure you've got good, adequate liability insurance. But what we're worried about would be, what if someone got hurt to the point where their injuries exceed the limits of your insurance policy?
Yeah, because then what?
And then if you're holding it in your personal name, it's possible that all of your personal assets can be at risk.
Wow.
And so that's why we set up these LLCs, kind of segmenting those assets over into this corner, this box over here, and say that, the liability over and above my insurance policy now is limited to just the assets that I've contained in this LLC.
So really, if one just kind of does this willy-nilly and decides not to go that route, you really are putting yourself in a pretty major risk position. I mean, if something really bad happened, it could be really ugly, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, it can be. It really can be. And the time and expense that it takes to set up an LLC and get a tax ID number and a business checking account really pales in comparison to the liability you could be exposing yourself to, and frankly, just the peace of mind that you get knowing that now you're much more shielded from those types of risks.
Well, and I know Alan and I have so appreciated all the advice that you've given us through the years, and he has taken care of all of our paperwork and handling all of that, and it's been so painless, I have to say, and very cost effective, in my opinion, for, like you just said, the peace of mind. The peace of mind is huge, I think. And plus, you just want to make certain that everybody's well protected and, you don't have any loose ends. But I guess that brings me to another question then, because I understand you have to have adequate insurance and you want to make certain that, you've got yourself protected. So if you have an LLC and let's say you really start acquiring quite a few properties, how many properties then would you recommend to go into one LLC versus setting up multiple? Because there's some rule of thumbs that, you hear people say you want a property in an LLC and you have quite a few of them, or you have 3 in them. I've heard some people say you have a certain dollar amount in them. It's what's your advice on that?
Right, and it's a really common question. And there's really, you could ask 5 or 10 different attorneys and potentially get 5 or 10 different answers, right?
So there's really no right or wrong.
There's not necessarily a right or wrong here. It becomes more of, I think, rule of thumb and personal preference. But what I think is a really reasonable way to approach it would be that don't I don't think it's really, I think it's overkill to have an LLC for every single property.
Okay.
I've got clients that have 100 properties. They'd have 100 LLCs. That would be kind of hard to keep track of for them.
Okay.
Right. So I think instead of number of properties,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's good to gauge it based on market value of
Okay.
those properties. And so now we're thinking about what are the assets potentially that could be in this LLC and be at risk.
Okay.
And so I think somewhere I tell most of my clients, don't go over the $1 to $1.5 million worth of market value if you can help
Per
it.
LLC.
Per LLC, correct.
Okay.
Because I think once you go over that, you've really started to put much more of a bullseye on you
Okay.
for someone to try to go over and above liability policies.
Okay.
And so I think at that point, you've really probably put too much at risk in any given LLC, and it's time to just set up a second one.
So, okay, so here's one that I'm throwing out here at you is then, so where does the trust part come into play? Because you know how a lot of people have their
Mhm.
personal homes and things in trusts or
Correct.
assets in trusts, and then they've got their rental property sitting over here and they've got that in an LLC. It's like, where does that trust and the LLC kind of meet in the middle? I mean,
Right.
does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. And so for a trust and an LLC can absolutely work together, and they
Okay.
do all the time. One of the things that a lot of my clients will do is they'll have a trust, and we'll make their trust the owner of LLCs.
Okay.
And so the idea behind that would be that we've got some liability protection from our LLCs,
Uh-huh.
but we've also got a plan in place so that if something happens to, mom and dad, let's say,
Sure.
they've got their plan in place as to how are these properties now going to be managed
Mhm.
and provide for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so it also loans that people have can really come into play here too. And
Okay.
so it's always a little bit harder to move these properties around into LLCs and things once
Mhm.
there are already loans in place.
Okay.
So better, if at all possible, to start out with an LLC with loans set up the right way, because if someone buys a property in their names,
Right.
they're most likely have set up a personal loan,
Mm-hmm.
personal mortgage.
Right.
And if they take out a loan in their LLC, it's going to almost always be a commercial loan, which has
That's true.
different rate options and different
Mhm.
down payment requirements. And so banks can get sometimes not really like people to take a property that's got a personal mortgage on it and
Right.
put it into an LLC.
Sure.
And so better, if at all possible, to start that off on the right foot from the very beginning.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is you would be way better off if you're starting the investment from the get-go to seek an attorney and literally go through that process right from the beginning, because as Nathan said, switching midstream with loan products, it does make it very tricky. That's
Right.
for
It
sure.
could be trickier. It's always, it's less time consuming and less costly
Mhm.
to do things right from the beginning.
Right.
Right. But if you're halfway through something and
Right.
you have properties, I wouldn't let it hold you back from
Right.
still doing it a better way.
Right. Right.
Sure.
Sure. So from a tax standpoint too, it sounds like the liability, or as far as like the LLC, is probably the better way to go too. It's like you said, you've got your own EIN number, you're keeping it separate. It probably makes it a lot easier tax-wise too.
It absolutely does. Yeah, it makes it much
Yeah.
easier tax-wise, and depending on how it gets set up, sometimes
Mhm.
we can even set it up so that you don't have to file a separate return.
Mm-hmm.
Some people will set up an LLC and we'll make the ownership in a way that they can still put it just on a schedule to their
Mhm.
personal return, and so it really doesn't add that much
Right.
come tax time.
Right. So is there anything else that you could think of, Nathan, that would be good advice to share with our folks listening in this morning that would be something good to know from the investment legality side of things? Is there anything else that comes to mind?
The biggest thing I would say is that as people start acquiring properties, is to keep in mind that those are all things a lot of people think of them as investments, and they think of them a little bit different than their own personal home. And
That's true.
but it's really a large asset that you're starting to build,
Mhm.
and an asset that you certainly should plan for.
Mhm.
And so just setting up an LLC is great, but I do a lot of work in the probate court after someone has passed away,
Mhm.
let's say, and the only thing worse than one house going through probate is going to be a whole portfolio of houses going through probate, right?
I can't even imagine.
And so houses going through that court system, they don't sell for top dollar.
Right.
There's usually, people have to pony up personal money to try to make improvements. It's just takes, a year or longer to make it through. And so that's the type of thing where just a quick, honestly, just a few pieces of paper can make all the difference. And so it's worth talking to somebody to make sure you've really got it set up correctly.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Well, and that's exactly why we have you here this morning, Nathan, with us, because I know just from our own personal experience in working with our clients, there are so many ins and outs on this, and just all the different things that Nathan just talked to us about. I think it's very apparent that it really does pay to get your portfolio set up in the correct way, just from your sanity, your peace of mind, the tax, the liability. There's just so many moving parts on this. And I have to say, Nathan Jones here is a fantastic resource, because he can not only help you set up with your investments, but he can tie it all into your estate. And like you said, keeping things out of probate. And, you've worked very long and hard to grow your assets. So eventually you want to hand those down to your heirs and make it as clean and neat as possible, because, at that time, it's always a tragedy in one's life. And you want to make certain that your loved ones are well taken care of and that you've got a very good resource. So Nathan Jones is one that I would definitely highly, highly recommend to reach out to, and definitely tap into his knowledge and expertise. And he does wonderful customer service and can answer any of your questions that you might have. So we can't thank you enough for helping us on all you've done.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
It's been a pleasure working with you through the years. So
thank you, Beth.
Truly
Likewise.
a pleasure. So, well, thank you very, very much, guys, for joining in with us this morning. Hopefully you found this segment to be very beneficial. Next week, we're going to add another layer to our series then on this investment topic, and add a perspective of the lender, because it's it's all pieced together. But then I think at the end of the series, you're going to kind of see how it all ties into play. And that way, then you've got the resources, so that when it's time for you to decide to make real estate investments, you've got all the resources and the knowledge that you need. So thanks again, Nathan, for joining in this morning. So feel free to reach out to Nathan Jones at his practice anytime you need his help, and he'll do you a wonderful job. So we appreciate you tuning in this morning. Hope you guys have a great week. Enjoy the beautiful sunshine and the weather, and we'll see you next week.